This is Evidence in Silence, a documentary-style true crime podcast. Where the story ends, the questions begin. In the early hours of April 1st, 2006, a young man was seen entering a bar in Columbus, Ohio. His name was Brian Shaffer. He was 27 years old, a second-year medical student. He had plans, responsibilities, a future that appeared clearly mapped out. That night, Brian met friends in the Arena District. They moved between establishments. They talked. They drank. Security cameras captured Brian entering a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. He was seen speaking with two women near the entrance. He appeared relaxed, unhurried. Nothing in his behavior suggested distress. Later that night, Brian was seen again, briefly, near the entrance of the bar. And then, nothing. After that moment, he was never seen on camera again. When the bar closed, his friends searched for him. They checked inside, outside, nearby streets. Calls went unanswered. Messages were not returned. At first, it seemed possible that Brian had simply left on his own. But as the hours passed, assumption gave way to concern. Police reviewed surveillance footage. They examined every available camera angle. They tracked individuals entering and exiting the building. Brian was clearly recorded entering the bar, but there was no confirmed footage of him leaving. The bar had a limited number of exits. All were accounted for. And yet, Brian Shaffer was gone. In the years that followed, the case would draw national attention. A man captured on surveillance inside a crowded urban environment, vanishing without explanation. No confirmed sightings, no financial activity, no verified contact. A disappearance measured not in days, but in minutes. How does someone disappear inside a building filled with people? That question remains unanswered. Brian Randall Shaffer was 27 years old in April of 2006. He was a medical student at The Ohio State University. By all accounts, Brian was intelligent, social, and driven. He had grown up in Pickerington, Ohio, in a close-knit family. Those who knew him described him as outgoing and warm. He was comfortable in conversation. He enjoyed music. He played guitar. He liked spending time with friends. Medicine had not been a casual decision. His path toward it was deliberate. He had worked hard to gain admission to medical school. The workload was demanding. Long hours of study, clinical rotations, high expectations. Despite the pressure, Brian maintained an active social life. Friends said he balanced intensity with humor. He could be serious when needed, but he also enjoyed going out, spending time in the Arena District, relaxing after exams. In the months leading up to his disappearance, Brian had experienced significant loss. His mother had passed away from cancer. The loss was profound. Family members later said he was still processing that grief. Grief does not always show itself loudly. Sometimes it lingers quietly. Even so, there was no indication that Brian intended to walk away from his life. He had upcoming travel plans. He and his girlfriend had discussed a vacation. He remained engaged in his coursework. There were no reports of threats, no signs of escalating conflict, no documented warnings. Understanding who Brian was is essential to understanding why his disappearance remains so unsettling. He was not isolated. He was not estranged. He was surrounded by friends, classmates, family, people who expected to see him again the next day. And yet, after entering a crowded bar in the center of a busy entertainment district, Brian Shaffer vanished. Not in a remote field, not along a deserted highway, but inside a building equipped with security cameras and filled with witnesses. That contrast, between normalcy and sudden absence, is what defines this case. On the evening of March 31, 2006, Brian Shaffer met his friend William Clint Florence in Columbus, Ohio. It was a Friday night. The Arena District was active. Crowds moved between restaurants and bars. Music spilled into the streets. The sidewalks were busy. The atmosphere was typical for the area. Brian and Clint began the evening at a restaurant. They talked, they ate, they drank. There was nothing unusual about their plans. At some point later in the night, they met up with another friend, Meredith Reed. The three of them decided to continue their night out together. They headed toward a nearby bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloon. The bar was located on the second floor of a commercial complex known as the South Campus Gateway. Access to the bar required either an escalator or an elevator. There was no exterior entrance. Security cameras monitored the escalator area and the main entry point. At approximately 1:15 a.m., surveillance footage captured Brian Shaffer entering the Ugly Tuna Saloon with Clint and Meredith. Brian appeared calm, relaxed. There was no visible argument, no signs of distress, no urgency in his movement. Once inside, the group did not remain together the entire time. They separated at moments, as groups often do in crowded bars. But they remained in contact. Witnesses later described Brian as acting normally. He was social. He was drinking. He was talking with others. There were no reports of unusual behavior. As closing time approached, Brian was seen near the entrance area of the bar. Surveillance footage shows him briefly speaking with two women near the top of the escalator. The interaction appeared casual, short, unremarkable. There was no indication that it carried special meaning. After that moment, Brian moved out of the camera's view. It would be the last time he was ever recorded on surveillance. Around 2 a.m., the Ugly Tuna Saloon closed. Clint and Meredith exited the bar. Brian did not. At first, there was little alarm. They assumed Brian had left on his own. Perhaps he had gone home. Perhaps he had stepped outside. Perhaps he had left with someone else. They called his phone. There was no answer. They waited. Minutes passed. Concern began to replace assumption. Security footage from the building was later reviewed in detail. Numerous patrons were seen entering and exiting the escalator area. Brian Shaffer was clearly captured entering earlier in the night, but there was no confirmed footage of him leaving. Investigators examined the building's layout. The number of exits was limited. Most were covered by cameras, and yet, Brian was not seen exiting through any of them. As the night ended and early morning approached, Brian Shaffer was unaccounted for. What had begun as a routine night out was quietly becoming something far more difficult to explain. When Brian Shaffer was reported missing, law enforcement began reviewing surveillance footage from the South Campus Gateway complex. The building housed multiple businesses. Security cameras were positioned near primary entrances and exits. The escalator leading to the Ugly Tuna Saloon was covered by video. Footage clearly showed Brian entering the escalator area around 1:15 a.m. He was walking with his friends. Later footage captured him again, briefly, near the entrance to the bar, speaking with two women. Then he moved out of the camera's frame. Investigators focused carefully on footage recorded at closing time. They reviewed video of patrons leaving the bar area. Numerous individuals were visible descending the escalator. Others exited using the elevator. Groups left together, some left alone. But Brian Shaffer did not appear in any confirmed exit footage. This absence became the defining puzzle. The Ugly Tuna Saloon was located on the second floor. To exit through the main route, patrons would need to pass the escalator camera. Alternative exits did exist, but they were limited. One service exit was primarily used by staff. Another emergency exit led into a construction area adjacent to the building. Investigators examined whether Brian could have left through one of these secondary routes. The service exit was reportedly monitored and not accessible to patrons. The emergency exit was not typically used by customers and required navigating a restricted area. There was no confirmed footage showing Brian using either route. This left investigators with a troubling question. If Brian entered the bar, and if cameras covered the primary exits, how did he leave without being recorded? Footage was reviewed repeatedly, frame by frame. Officers considered whether Brian might have exited in close proximity to another individual, shielded from clear view. They explored the possibility that he could have changed clothing to avoid recognition. They examined lighting, angles, potential blind spots. No definitive answer emerged. It is important to remember that surveillance systems in 2006 were not as advanced as those used today. Video resolution was limited. Angles were imperfect. Some areas were not covered. While the footage strongly suggested Brian did not exit through the main escalator route, investigators could not state with absolute certainty that he did not. The case became defined by what was not seen. No confirmed exit. No confirmed direction of travel. Just a final visible moment near the entrance to the bar. From that point forward, Brian Shaffer was no longer visible. Not on camera. Not to friends. Not to family. The surveillance review did not reveal a crime. It did not reveal an abduction. It revealed absence. And that absence would shape every theory that followed. As the morning of April 1st unfolded, Brian Shaffer had not returned home. At first there was uncertainty. Friends believed he may have left the bar independently. Perhaps he had gone home with someone. Perhaps he had stayed out later than expected. But as the hours passed, that explanation became less convincing. Brian had not contacted anyone. He had not returned calls. His phone rang and then went to voicemail. By the following day, concern had intensified. Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, became actively involved. Family members began reaching out to friends and acquaintances. No one had seen Brian after the bar closed. A missing person report was filed with the Columbus Division of Police. Officers began interviewing those who had been with him that night. William Clint Florence and Meredith Reed recounted the evening's timeline. Their accounts were consistent. There had been no argument, no visible altercation, no sign that Brian intended to disappear. Investigators expanded their search beyond the South Campus Gateway complex. Hospitals were contacted, jails were checked, local taxi companies were questioned. No record surfaced placing Brian anywhere after 2 a.m. His cell phone activity was examined. The last known ping placed his phone in the area of the bar around the time it closed. After that, the phone either powered down or lost signal. It was never used again. Search efforts extended into nearby streets and parking structures. Officers canvassed the arena district. They spoke with bar staff. They reviewed additional surveillance from surrounding businesses. No footage confirmed Brian walking outside the complex. No witness reported seeing him in distress. The Scioto River, located within driving distance, was considered during early search efforts. But there was no direct evidence connecting Brian to the water. Days passed, then weeks. Brian did not access his bank accounts. He did not use his credit cards. He did not attend classes. He did not contact family or friends. His belongings remained untouched. There was no financial activity, no digital communication, no confirmed sightings. For investigators, the absence of activity was significant. Voluntary disappearances often leave traces: preparation, movement of money, contact with someone. In Brian's case, there was none. The initial investigation produced interviews, timelines, and hours of surveillance review, but it did not produce answers. What began as a missing person report was evolving into something more complex, because every path outward from that bar led to the same conclusion. Brian Shaffer had entered the ugly Tuna Saloona, and after that the trail went cold. As investigators continued reviewing the case, attention returned to the building itself. The South Campus Gateway complex was not a simple structure. It housed restaurants, retail space, offices, parking access. The ugly Tuna Saloona occupied space on the second floor. Access required using an escalator or an elevator from the main ground-level entrance. At first glance, the layout appeared straightforward, but closer examination revealed complexity. The escalator area was covered by surveillance. Anyone ascending or descending was typically captured on video. But surveillance coverage was not absolute. Cameras in 2006 did not offer continuous high-definition recording. There were blind spots, areas where angles did not overlap, moments where individuals could move briefly out of frame. Investigators studied the physical layout carefully. Behind the bar area were service corridors, access points used by employees, delivery routes, utility spaces. Most of these areas were not intended for public use. But in crowded environments, movement can become fluid. Doors open, staff pass through, patrons follow. One emergency exit led toward a construction zone adjacent to the building. At the time, portions of the complex were still under development. The area was partially lit, not heavily monitored. Law enforcement examined whether Brian could have exited through that space, but there was no footage confirming it, and no witness reported seeing him leave that way. Another consideration was whether Brian may have remained inside the building after closing. Searches were conducted. Restrooms were checked. Storage areas were examined. No trace of him was found. Structural schematics were reviewed. Officers worked to determine whether there were hidden passageways or overlooked exits. None were identified that would allow someone to leave undetected without significant effort. Still, the possibility of blind spots remained central. Surveillance footage can create a false sense of certainty. A camera captures what it sees, but it cannot capture what falls just outside its frame. Investigators acknowledged that while Brian was not seen exiting through the primary route, they could not state with absolute certainty that he did not. In complex urban structures, small timing gaps can matter. A few seconds, a blocked angle, a crowded stairwell. Sometimes, disappearance does not require invisibility. It requires timing. The building did not provide answers. It provided limitations. And within those limitations lay the most frustrating reality of the case. Brian Shaffer was last seen inside a structure filled with people, surveillance cameras, and defined exit points. Yet somewhere between the bar's closing and the early hours of the morning, he passed beyond observation. Whether through a blind spot, a secondary exit, or circumstances still unknown, the building kept its silence. As the years passed, the disappearance of Brian Shaffer generated multiple theories. Each attempts to answer the same central question: how did he leave the building without being seen? One theory suggests that Brian exited the bar normally but was simply missed on camera. Surveillance systems in 2006 were not flawless. Angles were limited. Resolution was modest. Crowds at closing time created visual clutter. It is possible that Brian left among a group and was not clearly identified. This explanation is straightforward, but it does not account for what happened next. If Brian left the building normally, why was there no further trace? No taxi record, no confirmed ride, no bank activity, no contact. Another theory proposes that Brian left voluntarily and chose to disappear. Supporters of this idea point to personal stressors in his life. He had recently lost his mother. Medical school was demanding. Grief can manifest quietly. However, there is no evidence that Brian made preparations to leave permanently. He left behind personal belongings. He had upcoming plans. There was no indication of financial preparation or relocation effort. Voluntary disappearance remains possible, but unproven. A more troubling possibility is that Brian encountered foul play after leaving the bar. If he exited undetected, he may have met someone outside. An altercation could have occurred beyond the camera's reach. Yet no physical evidence has confirmed such an event. No witnesses reported a disturbance in the area. No remains were discovered. Some have speculated that Brian never left the building at all, that he may have accessed a hidden or overlooked area within the structure. Investigators thoroughly examined this possibility. Extensive searches did not reveal evidence that Brian remained inside. The building continued operating. Renovations occurred in later years. No trace was found. Each theory explains part of the mystery. None explain all of it. That is what keeps the case unresolved. There is no single narrative that fits every known detail. Instead, there is a collection of possibilities and a gap in evidence that has never been closed. Brian Shaffer entered a bar in a crowded district. He was seen on camera, and then he was not. Everything that follows exists in uncertainty. In the years since April 2006, the disappearance of Brian Shaffer has remained open. Investigators have revisited the case. Surveillance footage has been reviewed again. Witnesses have been re-interviewed. Search efforts have extended beyond Columbus. Despite these efforts, no confirmed lead has brought resolution. Brian's family has continued seeking answers. Public appeals were made. Media coverage resurfaced periodically. Each renewed wave of attention brought hope that someone might come forward with information overlooked in the beginning. But no definitive breakthrough occurred. There have been reported sightings over the years. None were confirmed. No remains have been discovered. No financial activity has surfaced. No digital trace has emerged to suggest that Brian began a new life elsewhere. The case remains classified as an open missing person investigation. Law enforcement has not publicly stated that foul play has been confirmed. At the same time, there is no evidence that Brian intentionally disappeared. It is this uncertainty that defines the case. A man recorded entering a bar in a busy urban district, a building equipped with surveillance, friends nearby, witnesses present, and yet, no confirmed exit. The questions persist. Did he leave unnoticed? Did he encounter danger after stepping outside? Did something occur within a blind spot that cameras did not capture? After more than a decade, the absence of evidence has become the defining feature of the investigation. Time has not clarified it. Technology has not resolved it. The footage still shows the same sequence. Brian entering, Brian speaking near the entrance, and then Nothing. Not a struggle. Not a pursuit. Just the quiet end of recorded certainty. A disappearance not from wilderness or isolation, but from within a crowd. Until new information emerges, the case of Brian Shaffer remains unresolved. And the final confirmed image remains unchanged. A young man stepping out of view and into silence. This has been Evidence in Silence. Where the story ends, the questions remain. Thank you for listening.